Hello and welcome back to another update. As we cover the latest developments throughout the front line, we start out in the direction of Kherson, where the Ukrainian forces have continued their over river assaults against the Russian forces. First off, we saw the initial assaults against the village of Pishanivka here to the southwest of Pridniprovsk. Then we saw a second assault here to the southeast of Sadove in the direction of Pitstepne. So both of these assaults managed to reach across the Dnieper River, and the Ukrainian forces have established positions in the islands in the center and have even sent deep reconnaissance groups against Pitstene and Pishanivka. So the Ukrainian forces are continuously building up their presence here in the islands in the center of the Dnieper River, across in the eastern bank of it. So we're seeing that they are increasingly preparing for an assault against the Russian forces. The Russian forces have in turn relocated forces from Verbove and down to the Kherson direction, trying to face off against these Ukrainian forces. Moving on to the Urushaina direction, we saw the Ukrainian forces advance slightly here to the northeast of the Russian positions, and they've also started laying mines to the south and east of Urushaina, indicating that they are now looking to set up this position as a defensive position and not advance much further than this. They're trying to first push out the Russian forces here in the east of Urushaina to have a proper position in the direction of the village and to prevent a Russian counterattack. But they have started laying mines here to the south and to the east of Urushaina. We then move on to the Marinka area, where the Ukrainian forces have had a slight advance here to the north of Marinka, where they managed to advance the direction of the warehouse, and the Russian forces still hold on to the positions here to the north of the city, with just a small bit left in Ukrainian hands. We then move on to the Pervomaiska area, where here the Ukrainian forces have essentially recaptured everything except for a small part. So this would be the reverse Marinka in terms of how much they control. The Ukrainians essentially control over 90% of the city, while the Russians control over 90% of Marinka. We then move on to the Avdiivka area, where here the Russian forces managed to advance in the northern parts west of Krasnohorivka, both to the northwest of the village in the direction of the railways, to the west in the direction of Stepove, where they've managed to reach the forest lines, and in the south capturing the trash waste area to the north of Avdiivka, and it seems that they are currently planning on an operation towards the coke plant, where there's been a significant increase of artillery in the direction of Avdiivka and the northern parts, which would indicate an assault on the coke plant. This is an industrial area similar to the Bakhmut direction, where they have the Azovstal steel plant here in the northern parts. The coke plant is similar to that. It took the Wagner forces a week or two to capture this, so most likely we'll see something similar in the north of Avdiivka. As for the northern parts in the direction of the north of Novobakhmutivka, the Ukrainian forces launched a small attack in the direction of the village south of Oleksandropil and managed to capture one of the fortifications of the Russian forces here to the north of the village. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where the Russian forces managed to advance slightly north of Zelenopilya, and the Ukrainian forces managed to advance through the railways and across the east of Anderivka. To the north of Bakhmut, we see that in the direction of Berhivka, the Russian forces managed to advance a small bit, capturing one of the fortified areas of the Ukrainian forces to the south of Berhivka. Moving on to the northern parts, the Russian forces had a small advance to the west and southwest of Genovo-Popivka, and in the northernmost parts, we see the Russian forces managed to advance a slight bit to the southwest of Pereshotravneve, and the Ukrainian forces managed to advance a major part in the direction of Orelyansk, where they managed to capture multiple Russian fortifications. The latest developments suggest that the Ukrainians have largely diminished their offensive capabilities after the 5-month-long offensive here in the south towards Zaporizhia, and thus they have given up on breaking through the Russian defenses in the south, which has largely put a stop to movement in the southern front. What we do see is that they are trying to consolidate their positions, for example, in the direction of Urushaina, where they've now switched to defensive operations, forming the battlefield for the defense and setting up mines. The same in the direction of Kherson. However, here we see that there may be an indication that they may still attempt to get some sort of foothold. If they're able to get a foothold, then they may start some operations in this direction, but it seems that it is difficult due to the factor that they have lost most of their offensive capabilities in this direction as well. The thing is that they may be preparing to essentially form the battlefield for a Kherson-Dnipro River offensive in the next offensive in the next spring or summer. So essentially what we're seeing is that these are shaping operations for the Ukrainian forces to try and establish positions across the Dnieper River. In the central part and direction of Donetsk, we see that there is massively Russian operations in the north, in the direction of Avdiivka and so on, while the Ukrainian forces are trying to counterattack in directions that the Russian forces have essentially left behind in favor of fighting by Avdiivka. So in directions the Russians have essentially advanced in throughout the past few months. This shows that although the Russians now have started going on offensive here and specifically around the Avdiivka area, it is a limited one where they do not have enough forces gathered in the direction of Donetsk to have full control over the whole front. So this means that the Russians are running a risky operation by leaving some of these areas vulnerable, as we see with the Ukrainian forces attacking both to the north and to the west and south of the Russian operations in Avdiivka. This shows that the Russians, with the focus of troops in the direction of Avdiivka, have left other areas in the nearby directions vulnerable, and the Ukrainians are making use of that. This could also be a Ukrainian attempt to essentially spread out the Russian forces to prevent them from gathering enough forces in one area to actually launch a successful offensive. Because it seems that although the Russian forces started out attacking in all directions, both to the south, west, and north of Avdiivka, it seems now that they have most of their focus in the northern part, which is also the most important one, because if they manage to capture the coke plant here to the north of Avdiivka, they would essentially be in a position where there would be zero supplies going in and out of Avdiivka, as there's no other roads. There are some minor small ones right next to the other parts going through the forest patches, similar to what was earlier called the Road of Death in the direction of Bakhmut, except this road is not paved at all. It is simply some of these minor dirt roads, similar to the other parts here in the direction of Bakhmut. So essentially what we're seeing is that if the Russian forces gather and take control over the coke plant with a massive offensive here to the north, where they have focused their forces and are now heavily bombarding Ukrainian positions, then they will be able to cut off all paved roads from Avdiivka, leaving the Ukrainian forces in a position where they have to drive through the muddy roads to the south and essentially be very vulnerable to any and all forms of Russian direct fire from these positions here to the south and to the north of the city. So it will be a repeat of the Bakhmut meat grinder. Moving on to the direction of Bakhmut, we see here that there are some Ukrainian and Russian positional fighting here in this direction. This is because the Russians have an interest in holding the line where it is, preventing the Ukrainians from advancing through these muddy fields to the south and to the north of Bakhmut, and therefore they're trying to establish their positions and prevent the Ukrainians from actually getting a breakthrough, because so far they've reached the railway lines, they have not broken through. Similarly to the Russian forces in the direction of Avdiivka, where they have reached the railway lines, they have not breached it nor broken through yet, and therefore we see that they are still building up their forces and are in the initial stage of the offensive. And then finally, in the northern direction by the Luhansk-Kharkiv border, there's still some positional fighting, and that is about it, as both sides try to advance a small bit. The Ukrainian forces trying to flank the Russian forces by attacking the direction of Orlyansk, which seems to be a bit weaker than the other positions, and taking advantage of the concentration of powers, while the Russian forces are just trying to take advantage of wherever position they can capture here in the northern front. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.